In this lesson, we will have a look at the concept of data, a database, the types of data, namely spatial and attribute, and then also the types of spatial data, namely vector and raster. Bear in mind that data is one of the 5 components of a GIS. In the context of the GIS, we are looking specifically at geographic data, and geographic data is any information on physical features or physical objects. The data often provides information on the location of a feature, in other words, where something is found, as well as a description of such a feature. So just bear in mind that reference will be made to geographical features or geographical objects. That simply refers to any physical feature that you're going to find out in the world. So it could be a mountain, it could be a river, but these includes constructed features like roads and dams and schools, for example. So geographic data is information on physical features or objects, and this data that the GIS specifically is interested in provides information on the location of a particular feature as well as a description of that particular feature. A database can be defined as the storage of data or the storage of information that is organized in such a way that it can be updated in a central place. So the database is the storage of data or information that is organized so that it can be updated in a central place. At the bottom, there's just a snippet from a past paper where this question was asked. And the candidates were expected to define the term database. The options given in the memo read as follows. It is a storage or collection of data or information that is organized so that it can be organized or updated in a central place. In geography, it is not necessary, but it would be good if definitions were given word for word. However, we do mark whether the concept is understood. As this question came from an older paper, please be reminded that definitions in geography now carry 2 marks as opposed to a single mark. When you consider that a GIS is interested in geographical data, so that it's able to link the data and create a digital map. This data that the GIS is interested in should be information or data that is based on where a feature is found as well as a description of that feature. In other words, the GIS is interested in where something is located, but the GIS is also interested in what is found in a particular location. If we consider that one of the functions of a GIS would be to create a digital map, if we use the feature circled on this topographic map, the GIS needs to know specifically where something is and what is found in a particular location. So in drawing the map, how did the GIS specifically know that this feature needed to be put in on this part of the map? And secondly, when it decided that there was something found in this location, how did the GIS know which symbol to allocate that feature in this location? So in other words, the GIS needed to know where this feature is located, but secondly, the GIS needed to know what the feature was that was found in a particular place. So very briefly, GIS is interested in where something is found, but the GIS is also interested in what is found in a particular location. The where comes from what we call spatial data. So the GIS is interested in spatial data, which indicates the where, but the GIS is also interested in attribute data that tells the GIS what is found in a particular place. So spatial data is data on the location of a particular feature, and attribute data is data that describes the characteristic of a feature. So in this instance, the attribute here is that there is a lighthouse. That is an attribute of this feature, and therefore the GIS knew to use a red star. And the spatial data in terms of its coordinates, the GIS knew exactly where to place this red star on this particular map. It is very important to remember how to define these two terms. They come up very often, yet grade 12s still struggle to define them. So spatial data is informational data on the location of a feature, in other words, where it's found, and that can often be in terms of its coordinates, the latitude and the longitude. And attribute data describes the characteristics of a feature. In other words, the attribute data describes what is found. In this instance, the attribute would be the fact that it is a lighthouse. Other attributes could be the height of the lighthouse, it could be the number of lights attached there, but in essence what's important is that the GIS is only interested in spatial data and attribute data. In other words, it wants to know location and it wants to know what is found there in order to link the data to a digital map, for example. So here are the other two common definitions you are expected to know. The difference between vector and raster data. So spatial data, which is locational data, is stored in the GIS in two ways. So information or data on the location of a feature can be stored in the GIS in vector form, or it can be stored in the GIS in raster form. We simply speak about vector data and raster data. It simply refers to the way in which the data is stored inside the GIS. Vector data is data or information that is given in the form of lines, points, and polygons. If you look at the topographic map, the data or the information on a topographic map is all given in terms of either a line or a single point or a polygon. Therefore, the topographic map is an example of vector data. Raster data is given in the form of pixels, or you can speak about grid cells, but every photograph or every picture is made up of a number of pixels. So raster data is given as pixels or grid cells, and therefore the orthophoto map is an example of raster data because the location of certain features are seen on the photograph and they appear as grid cells. So the difference between vector and raster is that vector, the information of the data is given as line, points, and polygons, whereas in the case of raster data, the information is given as grid cells. Just very quickly, just some more questions from a past paper. Differentiate, in other words, state the difference between spatial and attribute data. Please remember the key word here is that spatial data is locational data, describes where something is found. Attribute data describes the characteristics of a particular feature. Define the terms raster data and vector data. Remember, raster is any data or information given in the form of grid cells or pixels. You can use either one of the two words, whereas vector data is data or information given in the form of points, lines, and polygons. Again, the mark allocation could potentially be up to 4. Which one of the two maps, the topographic map or the orthophoto map, is an example of raster data? Remember, raster data is pixels, which is a photograph. Therefore, the answer is the orthophoto map. And the reason why you chose the orthophoto map because the orthophoto is made up of grid cells or pixels, but you can simply say that the orthophoto map is an example of a photograph or example of a vertical aerial photograph for that matter.